We are talking today about Sarah Orne Jewett's story, The White Heron. And this is, you know, quite a bit different than the last several things that we read on the syllabus. We're jumping. We started out with Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, one of the earlier things we read, Evangeline, and we talked about Romanticism and the flourishes of creative language that and poets like Longfellow and even prose writers used in that time period to try to elicit these strong emotional reactions from their readers, um, and how that romanticization um, glorified nature and glorified uh, feelings of reverence toward the universe and toward Longfellow toward God and the relationship between God and man, all that kind of stuff. Um, but then we jumped, from that to um, uh, Carolyn Shute, 1980s, a whole 150 years later, um, and we talked about realism and naturalism from around the turn of the century and um, how that particular mode of writing fit or didn't fit with what Shute was trying to do in The Beans of Egypt, Maine. But now we're going back again to the other end of the 19th century. Um, 18 Late 1860s is when Jewett started writing, and then she continued with some success to publish um, throughout New England and have develop a readership throughout New England throughout the 1870s and the 1880s. Um, Now, I have to confess a favoritism toward the 19th century. The writers from the 1800s have always been my favorites. Um, and I like the scope of literary movement in that time period from the 1800s and early romanticisms of the early 1800s through the regionalists that um, sort of came to dominate the scene through the middle and after the Civil War in the 1800s, and then the move toward realism that came at the end of the century. And for some reason, I don't even know why, but that's always appealed to me. Um, I think part of it is that you feel like you're going into a time machine when you read stories from the 1900s, when there was no television, no radio, no media of any kind. You, and reading and writing was a different experience. Um, the visualization, the need to create a deeply rooted mental imagery for the story um, was very pronounced. I mean, you had to be able to create a um, a sense of reality that played in the reader's mind almost in a way that they were able to sort of visualize for themselves what we might call in these days, a movie. And so they spent a good deal more time um, evoking figurative language, emotional language, um, details of description to try to put the reader in the mindset and to try to create that sense of reality and that mental movie going on in the back of their head, even though they wouldn't have obviously had the term movie as a reference point. Um, but to read back then was to immerse yourself in another world, and that's even more so now reading the 18th century writers from the point of view of the 2020. I mean, that world was so different than this world that to be able to read a really good 19th century writer um, is like taking a trip backwards in time, and you get this little time capsule of what the world and the lives of the people were during that time period, and it's just something that I've always enjoyed. I've always enjoyed also Sarah Orne Jewett specifically, even though she's one of the minor writers, or might be considered. I'm sorry, that's not COVID-19. That's just the spring allergies. Um, she's probably considered one of the more minor writers um, of that time period. She didn't. She developed a readership outside of Maine and throughout New England, but probably, I'm not sure how far her um, works would have carried her out of New England in terms of her readership. Um, but she fits into this group of writers from that time period that modern scholars have called regionalists. And so regionalists or regionalism, I think, describes a a way of or a focus of writing in which the primary concern seems to be, from the reader's point of view, um, an attention to trying to evoke the world of a particular distinct place and time. So in America, there were, if you were to read a regionalist story from the Deep South, and then a regionalist story from New England, like one of Sarah Orne Jewett's stories, it would have a very different sound to it because those places were distinct, their patterns of speech were distinct, the culture and society, the levels of interaction and the ways of interacting with folks were very different than they were in New England. But the purpose for the writer was to try to create a real sense of what that part of the world was like, and to do it through capturing the nuances of character, the character speech, place and setting, um, images of setting, in a way that evoked a real sense of that place. Now, in more modern times, to be called a regionalist is a kind of an insult, I guess, because um, for some reason, scholars have sort of um, assigned a lower place on the rung of hierarchy of artistic endeavor to those people who spent in their minds too much time on place and setting and characterization, um, as opposed to tackling bigger thematic ideals. Um, and I don't know. That's just a personal. I guess that's up to the reader how much they care about that kind of thing. But I think it's pretty clear that that definition of regionalism that I gave applies to Sarah Orne Jewett. She had a really great, again, personal opinion, really great novella called Country of Pointed Firs, and which is set in England on a small New England port town that she gives a fictional name to, but from probably is one of those places like her hometown of Berwick, or not Berwick itself, but those little coastal villages, fishing villages that make up a lot of that twisty coastline in the southern part of the state. Um, and that book, you know, if you were to say, if you someone were to say, well, what was the plot of Country Appointed Furs? Plot? um, hmm, I don't know. There's a young woman, a budding writer who travels from Boston to this town, and she meets a lot of interesting people. I mean, that's the plot. I mean, really, nothing happens in the whole novella, but she fills up the hundreds of pages of, 150, 200 pages, something like that. I can't remember exactly, but with descriptions of the people, the place, the setting, the wildlife, the herbs, the characters, the seafaring captains of the time, and the farmers and the housewives. She's very interested in the internal lives of the women, especially that she meets, and she tries to capture what they were like and what their interests were, and those kinds of things. And so um, by today's standards, no plot, not much action. Um, it was a hard sell when I tried to teach it in in the Writers of Maine class. It was one of my favorite stories, and I tried a couple times to get it in the syllabus and have people appreciate it. But um, it's a hard sell. You have to really want to get into the details of what it was like to live in on a coastal town in Maine. Through hundreds of pages of character description, place setting, and that sort of thing. But she also wrote a lot of short stories that were a bit tighter, had some semblance of a plot, and though they also focused a great deal on the place and the feel of what it's like of the coast of Maine, they they were short enough that the action um, that the balance of action and description um, are more palatable for modern readers. Though this story also is sometimes a stretch for readers as well. I chose it because not only is it probably her most famous short story, you'll find it anthologized on lots of different uh, American fiction anthologies and that kind of thing. Um, but it also is a good transition for us as we read the last few things on our syllabus during next week, um, which are the short stories. Um, I'm sorry, not short stories, the children's stories by Maine authors that I selected for a small little representation of that type of writing in Maine. Now, um, so we're going. So this to really develop an appreciation for the story, you have to go back to the sensibility of what it's like to be a reader in the 1900s, and you have to have patience with some of the writing style and technique that doesn't seem quite as modern as maybe other things that we've read. Jewett grew up in Maine, lived in Maine most of her life, some short stints in Boston when she was young, but um, lived along the coast around Berwick, South Berwick, and up and down from there. Was very familiar with that part of the world. Those are the days without cars. She traveled that country in a horse and wagon many, many times with her father, who was a medical doctor, obstetrician, um, who did house calls, that's like they do in those days, and they rode up and down the coast in various places, meeting interesting people and characters, and her helping him and keeping him company, and uh, a very bright woman. She self-educated herself. I get well, she did go to school, of course, but she, in addition to the places she went to school, she read and read voraciously, and was interested in writing from a young age. Published her first book when she was, I don't know, 19, 20 years old. Short story rather, when she was 19, 20 years old, and never let up. Kept writing that whole time that she was living here. A real Mainer, uh, with a true love of Maine people and the and Maine, the nature that's such an important part of Maine, the coast, the woods, the birds, the lakes and rivers, um, and the people, uh, that that host of unique characters that decided to make the coast of Maine their lives. Okay, so we have this story, and it's set near the coast of Maine. We know that it's that the main character Sylvia is 9, 10 years old, something like that, and she um, has never seen the coast. Though they're close enough that she can hear it at night, and so that's a good uh, thing, a good part of what her life is like there. Um, and we know from some of the details in the story that she is living with her grandmother, and that her grandmother um, went to the town to pick Sylvia out of a litter of one of her daughter's children, set of children, to bring back to live with her in Maine. So in those days, that happened quite a bit, I guess, especially in towns like Lewiston or Portland, or where there were a lot of factories. Um, some of the families would move down there, get big, find that there were more kids than they could support, uh, and then would have to, you know, farm out their children to in-laws and um, grandparents and those kinds of things, in order to give them a better chance at life. Um, and so her grandmother has gone down to this town, city environment, picked the shyest and the quietest of the kids, Sylvia, and a person who didn't seem to like people very much, and or not have a great deal of tolerance for people, and then taken her back up to live in this small farm, small, well-kept, orderly, nice little farm on the coast of Maine. And as the story opens, um, we see that Sarah Orne Jewett has chosen to tell the story in this through a third person omniscient point of view. Um, so there's a narrator telling the story who has the ability to sort of slip into and report on the secret thoughts, the things that are going on inside the minds um, of her different characters. Um, and she uses that as a way to allow us to know things about the characters that they don't explicitly reveal through dialogue with other characters. Um, in the course of the story, for instance, she got some notes here, but in the course of the story, this omniscient narrator slips into the mind of Sylvia, of course, who's her main character, but also slips into the mind of Mrs. Mooley, the cow, to give us some of Mrs. Mooley's perspective on things, slips into the mind of Sylvia's grandmother, and to this young man, this hunter, who has found himself staying with them for the night, for a couple of nights. Um, and she even, at one point, slips into the mind of a pine tree and lets us know the pine tree's feelings and thoughts about what's going on at the moment. So there's this romantic element to the story as well. Um, but it's not, but it's not, um, it's not extra. It's ingrained in the theme of the story, I think, um, in that the way she um, the way she equalizes um, cows and trees and people in her treatment of point of view uh, suggests that something about the harmony of the possibilities of harmony between people and in nature. But anyway, so as the story opens, Sylvia is bringing this Mrs. Mooley home as part of her routine. Sylvia, we found out earlier, we find out sort of the middle of the story. Um, once she was taken from town and brought to the farm, immediately fell in love with it. She wasn't a fan of where she had been living in the city. She has this one image in her mind of this dried up geranium on a windowsill, noise and uh, boys whistling and chasing her, and um, it was not a relaxing, comfortable place for her. But as soon as she steps into the door of this dooryard of this little farmhouse, surrounded by the woods, the warm summer air, um, and opens and looks at the tidy, well kept little cabin where she's going to be home, and the cat comes out and rubs against her leg, and she knows immediately that this is going to be the perfect place to live, and she's very glad for it. And so the story opens later, and she's bringing this cow home who she regularly chases or goes down into the woods to find at the end of the night to bring back for milking. And the language that she uses to describe Sylvia, the metaphors and similes um, and the other descriptions um, really try to anchor our perception of Sylvia as a creature of the woods. In fact, her name, Sylvia, um, means of the woods or wood like or um, so she's a creature of the woods. She's found her home, her natural environment. As she doesn't really mind not having other people to be around. She likes this game that she makes up in her mind with the cow. Um, and as they come home in the evening, with the twilight, with the birds singing, the cool, moist air. They stop at the creek and the cow drinks, and she stands with her feet in the water, feeling the water run over her feet, listening to the birds, feeling a part of this natural environment in a very, very intense way that probably her young mind wouldn't have even been able to describe. So that's why we have a good third person narrator. She can summarize for us, this connection, this really intense connection. And so our story begins that way, and so then our conflict is that all of a sudden she hears this whistle, and there's this boy whistling at her. This is not, you know, something that's common since she's come to live out here in the Maine woods. Um, and so she reacts obviously with alarm. You know, she never sees anybody out here, and here's this guy whistling at her, and so she tries to hide, but he sees her and approaches her and says that he is a looking for birds. He's been hunting birds. It's a hobby of his, and he's looking for a specific bird. He's out of sort of stayed out too late. It's getting dark. And is hoping that she can find a place for him to stay. Now that may seem like a really odd request these days to have a stranger come up and say, "Hey, can I stay at your house tonight?" But I guess it was more of a usual thing then to put up guests who are traveling on the road and might get stuck around your house. But so um, so she brings the boy home, and I'm calling him a boy. He's a young man, but not very, but fairly and fairly young. I mean, when he says to his the Sylvia's grandmother that he's been collecting birds for a long time, ever since he was a boy, she has this shy grin, we're told, at that statement, because obviously in her mind, to say ever since I was a kid is kind of ironic, since in her mind he probably still looks like a kid. So he's not very old. I'm picturing 18, 19 years old maybe. Sylvia's 10, maybe 10, 9 or 10. Um, and um, he secures the night and some food, um, and starts spending time with the mother. Now, one of the things that regional writers did in those days, well, they still do, was, and one of the greatest contributions of regionalism, I think, probably to literature, was that some of the early regionalists started experimenting with ways to make the people from a certain locale sound realistic. So instead of having everybody talk the way a literary writer might put their dialogue down, the idea came, well, how do we make these people who are probably less educated or have certain local, for other reasons, have certain local quirks to their voices and their ways of pronouncing things. How do we make them come out as real? And and people like Mark Twain started, and others started playing with dialect, phonetically spelling the words that the characters were saying, leaving out letters, spelling the words in a slightly different way, trying to capture a tone or an inflection, a pattern of speech that that just doesn't come through when you write everything out in standard English. And so it's part and parcel of the whole thing of trying to make a really realistic story, or that captures the regional flavor of a place. And if you look at that element of the story, you see that he speaks in a dialect that is fairly educated. That is, he doesn't he uses fairly complex sentence structures. He has some little quirks to his speech that seem almost literary, ending a sentence in indeed, um, using, transitions like indeed this or indeed that, and getting all the grammar right, and all the words are spelled out correctly for him. And so it's clear that he's from a bit more of an educated place, and it's also clear that he, as he listens to Sylvia's grandmother, is aware. We're told that he's entertained by her quaint language. Um, so he's in this place that society might put as a little bit of more elevated societally over Sylvia's grandmother and Sylvia. And then for Sylvia's grandmother, obviously Sarah Orne Jewett is going to have to use some of those devices, those dialect devices. So she talks about she has the grandmother saying something like, "There's good pasturing for geese down below the mash," and trying to get that Maine accent. It's M-A apostrophe S-H, mash, not marsh, down below the marsh, but down below the mash. Um, she also, tries to spell. Well, she has her talk about. She mentions hunting for partridges, spelled it with leaving out the R, P-A, a little apostrophe to show that there's a missing letter, and then tridges, partridges instead of partridges, and squirrels, leaving out one of the R's in squirrel, and she does other things too, like leave out the final letter, the T's and the G's that end words to make the pattern, the speech seem less educated, more colloquial and country. Um, and so as the grandmother just sort of runs on about her life and telling these quaint stories and uh, using what expressions from the New England vernacular, the hunter is entertained. But he has an eye on Sylvia all the time because he's really interested in getting this bird. Um, and he thinks that Sylvia has seen it. He can see something in her expression that that suggests that she knows what he's talking about. And so he's paying a special attention to the way she reacts as the night goes on because he really wants to get any information from her. But she's so shy, she's not going to come forward with it easily. Um, um, we also learned that he's collecting birds. That is, he's shooting and stuffing them, as many different species as he can, in order to come up with his personal collection of birds. And this is a very 19th century scientific attitude toward the natural world. Lots of amateur um, scientists spent a lot of time killing and preserving and collecting species, um, and it was kind of a fad. Um, and you know, um, it's there in the story because it's contrast to the way Sylvia feels about nature, right? So Sylvia is a part of the natural world. She's described as her head as being flower-like. She's almost described. She's sort of a bird herself in some of the passages in the figurative language that's used, and she feels completely at one with the natural environment. Um, but this idea of collecting things and killing them through killing and preserving them and putting them in a room somewhere so that you can show them proudly to visitors is a whole another thing. It's a way of look. It's a way of looking at nature that completely objectifies it. Um, Nature isn't in itself, the lives of these critters in themselves isn't of importance. What's important is that you have them and that you have secured them and brought them into your home so that you can classify and categorize and just proudly display your uh, your accomplishment, you know. Um, and it's a point of view toward nature that that will eventually evolve. I mean, most scientists probably don't look at it that way anymore. Um, but in the time period there, um, yeah, killing and collecting a big deal. Um, in fact, one of our most famous ornithologists, James Audubon, probably killed more birds than than, uh, than maybe anybody in history, except for maybe the hunters who hunted them to kill them for their feathers. Um, yeah, he would go out, shoot the bird, stuff it, and then paint it. And so his paintings of birds are, you know, they look pretty dead. They're famous, but they overall look pretty dead. But anyway, so that's the conflict. It's a simple little conflict, very realistic in this sense that it's not a grand romantic conflict. It's not a big deal. It's just a little conflict, wherein when Sarah, not Sarah, Sylvia, when Sylvia goes out with the hunter the next day, um, she is torn because she actually kind of likes this young guy, likes in the way that a 10-year-old might have a crush on a 20-year-old. I mean, it's not I'm not implying there'd be anything untoward going on, but you know how a 10 or 11-year-old might have a crush on a 19, 20-year-old boy and find them really kind of exciting to be around and all this sort of thing. And the whole time that they're out together and he's shooting birds, she's feeling this little twinge. She really likes being here with him, really likes pleasing him. But oh my God, he just killed a bird and stuffed it in his pack. And he's also sort of wooing, as in playing her, gives her a pocket knife, other kinds of things, trying to get on her good side, hoping that she's going to open up and talk to him about where this heron might be. And so as they go to bed that night, the family goes to bed that night, she's thinking about, yeah, I think I do know where this bird is, and I'm going to get up early in the morning and I'm going to go find it. And so the next morning she gets up, she goes, and she climbs this big pine tree that she knows about. Um, in the process, Sarah Orne Jewett sort of romantically shifts into the mind of the pine tree and sort of lets us know how the pine tree must feel to be the host of this little woods child climbing up it early in the morning. Um, and she gets to the top and she can look out and she sees the ocean for the first time and she's sort of amazed at that. Um, and then she sees eagles and hawks flying around, and eventually she sees the heron leaving its nest down lower down toward the coast, and sees where it flies out of, and then the heron flies straight toward her and lands in the tree not far from her, and the heron doesn't know she's there, and she has this intense, moment with nature where she's in the top of this tree on this beautiful sunny Maine morning, looking at this bird who's in the tree with her, and just feeling her connection. Uh, and she comes down the tree after the bird goes and goes back home. And um, so um, the story's uh, conflict is, will she tell this fella where the bird is? Is it worth winning his affection, or maybe what she imagines affection, his approval anyway, and winning the money that he's promised to give her for her, for her and her mother if she can tell him where the so she can win money, she can win his approval, she can continue to feel that she's in some way managed to please him, and all of those things would be really important for her and for her grandmother. Um, but of course, at the crux of the story, um, she makes her decision and can't do it. She can't tell him where the bird is. It would just be too big of a betrayal. And of course, she herself doesn't tell us any of this. This is all through the omniscient narration, and so we know through that omniscient narrator what she's thinking, what she's feeling at the time. We just know that she doesn't tell, and we know that that the narrator speculates about whether it's better that she did tell or she didn't tell. You know, only time will tell. Only time will prove whether it was a smart thing to do or not. But effectively, she's made a choice. She'd rather be her own person, in love with nature, in touch with it, feeling a part of it, than to give up that and betray that in order to please this man, this young man, and the bigger world, you know, that would probably approve of what he's doing and think that she's making the wrong choice. Um, so I guess I love that about the story. I love that. You know, uh, the little girl makes the decision to be true to her nature and true to nature. Um, so um, yeah, it's a good little story, and it's a good transition into some of the things that you're going to read next week, which are you know the children's literature from some of our best historical children's writers. There. I hope you're having a good day. Take care. Bye.